Welcome back. The plan this week at the White House was to start a full-court press aimed at getting Americans a tax cut. But as he has managed to do so many times since taking office, President Trump managed to step on his own message, this time by picking a fight with the family of a fallen soldier. You may like President Trump, you may support his agenda, you may blame Congress, you might even blame the media, but 9 months into the presidency of Donald Trump, there has been no major piece of legislation passed and signed into law. And joining us for more is Christine Hughes of the Sarasota County Republican Party, Barry Edwards, a Democratic political consultant, Mitch Perry of FloridaPolitics.com, and we welcome for the first time Kate Bradshaw, news and politics editor at Creative Loafing. Welcome to you, Kate.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Christine, I'm going to start with you. Because as I just said, this happens week after week. We hear it's going to be health care. We hear it's going to be tax reform. The president needs a win. So right from the get-go, why would you pick a fight over this fallen soldier? And the stories throughout the week were about that and not about tax reform.
Well, quite frankly, I think blame goes all around on this one. First, I think Trump was wrong picking on Obama and George W. Bush on how they made calls or letters or did not do that. And he brought up, his chief of staff, General Kelly. I think the media really was out, though, trying to prove that Trump's response was insufficient for the situation. And Congresswoman Johnson, clearly politicized a condolence call that she personally defined as disrespectful. And Kelly even said, and I will agree on that, I think that Trump, he's not a great communicator in being crisp in how he expresses things. And from his heart, he probably tried to. It didn't come out well.
But the reason why it became a bigger story than that is because the president said he calls the family of every fallen officer, which has been limited since he came into office, and in fact, that turned out not to be true. He hasn't called every family.
You're right. And I don't know. I think sometimes maybe he thinks he did and he didn't. I can't explain that one. I just think this whole situation, though, has got multiple moving parts, and everybody needs to take a piece of the responsibility.
Barry, there's been a lot of criticism of the Florida Congresswoman, Frederica Wilson from South Florida, that number one, why was she overhearing this phone call? And number two, why did she need to politicize it?
Well, I think there's been a lot of politicizing. Number one, she was in a car with the family. And I think that the intent by the president, and I think really was good, I think from what I've read in some sophisticated accounts from some academics, he was trying to be Churchillian, and Churchill would talk about the machismo being a soldier. And I think that's what he meant, that you know what you signed up for. He wanted to be in a difficult situation. But it doesn't matter what the president thought or what Frederica Wilson thought, the congresswoman. It matters what the family thought. It's about the family and the soldier. And Trump should have ended it right when the criticism came back and said, hey, that was not my intent. I'm honoring you and your family and your son that died, and the other 3 soldiers died in that incident. But he just can't help himself. He has to push back. He has to be right. Even in a situation that I think he had good intentions, he destroyed it. And then she got involved, and then he attacked her. She wears the hats. By the way, her hats are in honor of her grandmother. And
I did not know that.
All hat, no cattle. And so he just can't help himself.
Okay, the one thing that Democrats and Republicans and independents do have in common is that we revere our fighting men and women these days. And it seems kind of unseemly that we are debating the body of a fighting soldier coming home.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's across the board. No matter who you talk to, people are disgusted with how political this got, how reality show-esque it got, when we could be talking about, in addition to honoring their memories, we could be talking about what happened that day and looking into it.
And Mitch, that's the next question, because we don't know what happened that day. And the questions that I have is, number one, why were U.S. soldiers on a mission where they were not allowed to have U.S. air cover? Yeah. Why were French planes there circling about? Why was it a contractor that had to extricate? And why aren't people asking more questions about that?
Well, they are now. You know, I think Senator Nelson's asked for an inquiry, and I think, look, you have to say Benghazi, okay? We had how many, 6, 7 inquiries about that, special select committees? There's going to be one on here because people are going to ask that now after this conflagration ends in the next couple of days, which it probably will. We'll move on to something else. But our foreign policy is, what's going on here? Donald Trump kind of ran actually as a, he criticized George Bush for the Iraq War, and he turned on a lot of the Breitbart folks in terms of being like isolationist here. And what are we doing in Niger? What was this all about? So there's a lot of questions about that. And going just back about the fallen soldier, the video, I saw this video of the widow bowled over on the casket, crying. And that, to me, is the biggest thing here. And this man, that's what we should be honoring here. And this other stuff is just more soap opera that provided by the president and the media.
All right, we are just getting warmed up, and we'll have much more on the Week in Washington right after we check the First Alert weather, so stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about the week in Washington, and joining us for more is Christine Hughes of the Sarasota County Republican Party, Barry Edwards, a Democratic political consultant, Mitch Perry of FloridaPolitics.com, and we're welcoming for the first time Kate Bradshaw, politics editor at Creative Loafing. Earlier this week, there was really an extraordinary speech by former President George W. Bush, who does not speak out a lot these days. He hasn't since he left office, but he made some pretty interesting comments. Let's take a look.
And our young people need positive role models. Bullying and prejudice in our public life sets a national tone, provides permission for cruelty and bigotry, and compromises the moral education of children. The only way to pass along civic values is to first live up to them.
Christine, it appears to many that the president was talking about President Trump. Did you see the president's comments this week? If so, what did you think of them?
Well, I'd like to talk about Bush's speech because I read the entire speech. And the headlines, again, from the media were all about Bush's, criticizing Trump. Now, clearly, Bush believes democracy globally. He believes in immigration. And he did talk about the danger of a nationalistic policy. But he also talked about his concern about the complacency of the youth. He referenced Madison, saying the youth of today, they don't understand the Constitution, they're not really understanding civics. And he even talked about Martin Luther King, saying we should not be judging the color of the skin, but the character of the person. So I think in the totalitarian look at his speech, I thought it was more Reagan-esque. I think he espoused more of the philosophy of the conservative Reagan administration.
Right, but he seemed to be taking on this president, President Trump, and the words that he uses and the reaction in terms of how we talk to each other about politics.
Well, I think he was being very, very gracious in how he expressed it, but clearly he believes that we should not be a country that is so focused from a nationalistic standpoint. I think he made that point very clear, and obviously he's trying to get that point over to the president.
Mitch, let me ask you, does any of what George W. Bush says about Donald Trump have any impact on what you see in terms of Republicans, whether it's in Sarasota or St. Pete or Tampa?
I don't think so. I think George Bush is not really, let's face it, he left office, in the 30s, the polls himself, right? He was not a popular president at the end of his term. And Donald Trump is a very different president, obviously, than George W. Bush. I don't know. I think that there's obviously an element of the Republican Party that misses him, certainly. And I heard liberals even lament George Bush in the days of Trump here. But I think that it's a different era. I think you mentioned immigration. Immigration is the driving force of why Trump got elected, in my opinion, and why it leads to the whole Breitbart Bannonization type of thing, and that's really important to the Republican Party. And they look at George Bush as a traitor on immigration. So I think that no, I mean, I just covered this race in House District 58, which is Hillsborough County, Eastern Hillsborough County. This guy McCord, nobody heard of. What was his biggest thing he had? He was for Trump. The moderate candidate Yvonne Fry was, I think, for Jeb Bush, actually. But she was for Jeb Bush, and they really killed her on that. So I think that Trump is bigger in Republican circles than he is certainly mainstream-wise.
All right, so Barry, Democrats are energized these days.
Yes.
Republicans are reliably come out to vote. I would imagine the secret to success here is who is going to win independent voters. And the question that you got to ask Democrats all the time is, what are you doing in order to come up with a message to do just that?
I'm glad you asked me that. Independent voters, I wrote an op-ed for the Tampa Bay Times a year and a half ago about that. There are no such thing as independent voters. 75% of independent or non-party registrants lean one way or the other toward their party. And if you're a Democratic-leaning independent, you're more likely a Bernie Sanders supporter. You're an independent and lean toward the Democrats because the party's not liberal enough. The same thing with the Tea Party independents. They're independent because the Republican Party's not conservative enough.
Well, what do you think about the independents, though, in this case?
So there's only about and that's why the Republicans have won, like Romney, who, when he lost to President Obama, won the independent vote by almost double digits. I mean, so the Republicans have been winning the independents consistently the last decade and a half. There's only about a quarter of the independents that are truly swing voters, and that's about 5% of the electorate. Those are the ones everybody's going after. But if you look at Florida, the last 4 elections, president, governor, 1%.
So, Kate, let me ask you this, because the president this week intended, but failed, to make it all about tax reform.
Right.
And we had an economist on the other night who said, you know what, when you argue for tax cuts, it's a pretty straightforward argument. If you're going to argue that the Trump plan is not this, it's not that, it's a much more complicated argument. When you look at the people who are, voters around here, whether it's Pinellas, the Suncoast, Tampa, what are you hearing in terms of their interest in tax reform and tax cuts?
I mean, honestly, I don't really hear much about it. I think it's the whole show is kind of captivating right now. But yeah, and the Tampa Bay area is such a mixed bag. I mean, it's either people want those programs and they see the need for revenue, or they don't. I mean, it's split.
I did see, Richard Corcoran, the House Speaker, who may be running for governor next year, he held a press conference in Tampa on Wednesday where he was all gung-ho for these tax cuts. And I said to him, isn't it going to raise the deficit? Because that's what some independent, groups say. And they say, no, they're going to have so much growth out of this that it's going to obliviate that. So the hardcore Republicans are very much behind the tax cut plan. But the rest of us don't really know much about it.
We learned with David Stockman that you're going to have deficits.
Let me bring up another interesting...
Republicans like them now when they're in power.
Let me bring up another interesting issue here. 1 month later, most of Puerto Rico still does not have electricity. There's been a lot of talk that there are a lot of Puerto Ricans who are moving to Florida, and whether or not that could change the political landscape here in Florida. There's been a lot of criticism about the federal response to Puerto Rico. President Bush was asked yesterday how he would grade himself. This is what he would say.
10 between 1 and 10, how would you grade the White House response so far to the...
I'd say it was a 10. Did the United States, did our government, when we came in, did we do a great job? Military, first responders, FEMA, did we do a great job?
You responded immediately.
Yeah, I got President Bush on the mind here. President Trump. Christine, I don't know too many people around here who believes that the federal response deserves a 10 on the scale of 10.
Well, Puerto Rico is clearly kind of a special case. First of all, I think that you had an island, so there was some delay in getting things there. They were showing scanning the port, and they didn't have truckers, drivers to get any of the supplies to the people that needed it. Puerto Rico's $70 billion in debt. It's been a known fact for years that their electric grid hasn't been even addressed. So that was, I mean, it's going to take more than just FEMA in the short term to try to address this whole infrastructure issue. The other thing that Trump did say, though, is maybe we just have to write off the debt that Puerto Rico has to get going again.
But then he was corrected by his Director of Office of Management and Budget.
Right, OMB, right.
Mick Mulvaney.
Right.
I think that this is a problem still. Marco Rubio said weeks ago that we should have the military in there. It's gone on deaf ears. A lot of people in Florida care a lot about this. You mentioned the fact that we've heard like 100,000 people perhaps may come to Florida.
Up to 500,000.
Really,
that's probably too high.
And you know, it's already changed politics in the Orlando area, where there's more Congress members from Democrats over the last election. Darren Soto, the first Puerto Rican member of Congress from Florida. And when we see in these gubernatorial and presidential elections that Democrats lose by 1.2%, what have you, this could very much be a game changer with all these Puerto Ricans coming over to Florida.
The last two gubernatorial races were 60 and 80,000. And so if you've got 100,000 Hispanic from Puerto Rico, now they're not all going to vote, but they're probably 70, 80% are going to vote for the Democrat.
All right, we have to take a quick break, and we'll return with final thoughts when we come back. Our guests join us right now for final thoughts, and we're all looking at the tea leaves. How do the events in Washington affect the politics here on the Suncoast? There was a special election in Miami, Kate, a few weeks ago. The Democrat won over a seat that was in Republican hands for a long time. The next one up on the list is the St. Pete's mayoral race. The current mayor, Rick Reisman, against the former mayor. It's been so close, Kate, and you've been following it. Where are we at?
Well, just today, results from a poll conducted yesterday were released that, you know, they're neck and neck, and for the first time, it showed Kreisman beating Baker. I mean, it was like by 0.8 of a point, but point being, this was the first time that polling had shown that, even though he won the.
And Christine, we have our own special election coming up in a couple of months to replace Alex Miller, who resigned.
Yes.
What's the sense among the Republican Party here in terms of how competitive this race is going to be? You obviously have Congressman Buchanan's son running, but the Democrats are going to have a very competitive primary.
Well, I think that I don't think Buchanan's campaign is taking anything for granted. I think they understand that the Democrats are very energized, as we're hearing. And I think it's going to be a good race. But as I've said before, Buchanan is going to he'll win that race.
Barry, are these special elections a real test in terms of whether Democrats, whether it's around here or around the state, can get their act together?
No. If you look at nationwide, the larger the electorate is, the more likely the Republicans to hold the seat. There was a couple specials where they won some state house seats where they had like 1,000 or 2,000 people voting. So those are not going to be mirror what you're going to see in real general elections. So the best test is when we see in Virginia in the elections there, we have a broader, a broader turnout that's going to be more reflected. So no, these aren't, and I liken that to Tadeo, but remember that seat was held by a black Democrat for 24 years. The Republicans should never have got the seat, and they only held it for 10 months.
If I could just say about the St. Pete mayor's race, Trump, Rick Reisman is trying to tie Donald Trump, Rick Baker, Donald Trump as Republicans.
Exactly.
Interesting that Baker did a radio ad yesterday for the first time. He actually said he'll protect St. Petersburg against Donald Trump. So even Baker, the only time he's acknowledging Trump, is saying, I'm going to be a bulwark against Trump in St. Petersburg. Interesting.
Right, but every time you have one of these special elections and a Republican wins it, it kind of adds to your storyline, which you have written a lot about, that the Democrats locally and statewide do not have their act together.
Yeah, and I think that it'd be fair, as Barry says, about the St. Pete election, which is what we're all focusing on here locally, Kate, myself especially. That is more, it's very local. I mean, in fact, the Reisman's been criticized for trying to nationalize it because the issues have nothing to do with Washington, D.C. They have to do with sewage and things like that. So maybe, if Baker does win, do we really say that has anything to do with Trump? It's probably a leap there.
And final point, we have 1 minute left. A new Gallup poll finds that Americans' approval of the United States Congress is 13%. Christine, what does that mean to you?
I think it's not surprising because they haven't done anything. So,
but that means, it falls on our own congressional delegation, does it not?
Well, it does. But I think that now that they have passed a budget, and we can debate that some other time, the tax cuts are going to make people look at Congress. If they get that through, I think Congress's approval will go up. The market is going crazy. Over 23,000 points. Small businesses are feeling that their regulations are being, loosened. People are feeling generally good.
All right, we have to leave it there. But before we go, we want to share with you some thoughts about last night's topic, white nationalist leader Richard Spencer speaking at the University of Florida. He was met by hundreds of protesters. $600,000 was spent on law enforcement to ensure everyone would be safe. Aside from a few arrests, there were few problems. Michael says, I thought universities are where ideas are exchanged, whether you agree with them or not. See Berkeley, 1960s. Ian says, I thought we had a world war that said Nazis were evil. What happened to that? And Gary says, seriously, if everyone would just stay away, including the instigating and provoking media, there would not be a problem. No stage, no show. This got all the attention he wanted, and the media satisfied their thirst for promoting division. Sad. No, what's sad, Gary, are people who bury their heads in the sand. These people are out there. They walk among us. They feel empowered these days, and it's the responsibility of the news media to report that. As Elie Wiesel said, quote, never again the glorification of base, ugly, dark violence. Well, if you'd like to join the conversation about tonight's topic, just visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/mysuncoast.com.abc7. And FYI, you can watch past discussions. They're on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. And remember, you can stay up to date on the latest breaking news instantly, like the University of Florida's situation, with the ABC News app. If you have an iPhone or an iPad and currently have our news app, you'll need to go to the App Store now and search for WWSB or My Suncoast, then download the new version. If you're an Android user, you'll just get the new version automatically. We want to thank our guests for being here tonight. Christine Hughes of the Sarasota County Republican Party, Barry Edwards, a Democratic political consultant, and Mitch Perry from FloridaPolitics.com, and Kate Bradshaw, the news and politics editor at Creative Loafing.